Hello everyone, and welcome to the Ali Sprotus channel. Please remember to subscribe to the channel and give this video a big thumbs up. Today, we are going to be discussing the film 28 Years Later, 2025. The narrative unfurls years after the initial cataclysm, a world still grappling with the remnants of the rage virus, though now it presents a different, perhaps even more insidious, threat. We find ourselves drawn into the orbit of a new generation, one that has never known the world before the swift, brutal collapse. The film seems less interested in the visceral horror of the initial outbreak, a landscape already well trodden by its predecessor, and more concerned with the psychological toll of rebuilding, or attempting to rebuild, society. One of the central figures is a young epidemiologist, perhaps echoing the early scientific zeal of characters like Dr. Hansen from previous iterations, though burdened now by the weight of historical failure. Her drive is palpable, a desperate need to find a stable equilibrium, fueled perhaps by the quiet tragedy she witnessed in her youth, a shadow of the original pandemic that perhaps claimed a family member. She is driven not by raw adrenaline, but by meticulous, almost obsessive research, a quiet nod to the intellectual backbone required to combat viral threats, drawing inspiration perhaps from the sheer persistence shown by those who tried to hold things together in the immediate aftermath. She collaborates somewhat reluctantly with a security operative, a man whose pragmatism is etched onto his face, a figure who views survival through the lens of immediate threat mitigation. This operative carries the silent scars of constant vigilance, a stark contrast to the scientist's abstract pursuit of cure or stabilization. His background suggests military or paramilitary experience, the kind of hands-on knowledge crucial when the veneer of civilization is thin. One can sense that his understanding of human nature under duress stems from direct, often brutal, encounters in the quarantine zones or the sparsely populated, safe territories. Their joint mission, which forms the core conflict, involves a fragile peace accord established in a coastal enclave, a place that appears superficially ordered, almost a cruel parody of pre-outbreak suburbia. The tension arises when a new vector, or perhaps a mutation, begins to surface, manifesting in a slightly altered, more cunning form of the infection. It's not just the mindless sprinting rage anymore. There's a calculated element to the new infected, suggesting an evolutionary leap that throws the established protocols, the very foundation of their rebuilt world, into immediate jeopardy. The film utilizes these contrasting approaches, the scientist's pursuit of understanding versus the operative's reliance on immediate force, to explore whether humanity has genuinely learned anything. Are they doomed to repeat the mistakes of overwhelming fear and inadequate preparation? There are subtle directorial nods, perhaps echoes of Danny Boyle's kinetic energy, blended with the stark, washed-out bleakness favored by later post-apocalyptic narratives, suggesting that the beauty of the ravaged landscape often masks the enduring ugliness of human politics under pressure. The climax revolves around a desperate race to secure a research facility, rumored to hold the original, untainted data, or perhaps a preemptive antiviral agent. The operative must rely on outdated military tactics, while the scientist must trust her often maligned theories about the pathogen's behavior under environmental stress. It is a testament to their uneasy partnership that when the final confrontation occurs, it is a synthesis of both skills, a tactical extraction underpinned by a sudden, scientifically informed maneuver that allows them a momentary reprieve, leaving the audience with the chilling realization that survival is not a destination, but an endless, exhausting negotiation with chaos. The film ends not with a clear victory, but with the weary acceptance that the next mutation, the next betrayal, is only a matter of time. The young epidemiologist, let us call her Dr. Aris Thorne, carries herself with a deliberate stillness that belies the tempest brewing in her mind. Her dedication isn't merely professional, it feels deeply personal, perhaps rooted in the stories she heard growing up in the shadow of the first plague, stories that painted a picture of utter societal disassembly. She approaches the remnants of the old scientific community with the reverence of an archaeologist handling fragile artifacts, yet her methodology is fiercely modern, always pushing past the established, safe theories which clearly failed before. One can almost visualize her poring over digitized archives, drawing parallels between forgotten influenza strains and the swift, devastating trajectory of the rage virus, fueled by lukewarm coffee and the sheer, desperate hope that knowledge can somehow trump biology. Her inspiration seems drawn from the overlooked figures of early epidemiology, those who fought invisible wars with statistics and peer-reviewed journals, not bullets. Opposite her stands Commander Silas Vance, the security operative. Vance is a man built of sharp angles and perpetual readiness, his face a map of sleepless nights spent patrolling perimeters. His pragmatism isn't cynicism, it's a survival mechanism honed in the borderlands. He likely trained in some reformed branch of military security, perhaps specializing in containment breaches before the fall, which gave him an unnerving clarity about human fragility. When he speaks, his voice is low, gravelly, accustomed to being obeyed instantly. For Vance, Aris's abstract pursuits are secondary to securing the immediate perimeter. He trusts what he can see, touch, and neutralize. He views the fragile coastal enclave not as a beacon of hope, but as a highly flammable resource waiting for a spark. His emotional landscape is muted, his strongest expressed sentiment being a deep, abiding distrust of anyone who suggests things are permanently better. The fragility of their coastal settlement, called New Providence, is a masterpiece of tragic set design. It looks like a resort community painstakingly salvaged and then fortified with rusted metal and grim determination. The citizens there are a patchwork of survivors, some clinging desperately to old corporate structures, others embracing a hardscrabble communalism. The tension between Aris's faction, advocating for controlled genetic study to isolate immunity markers, and Vance's camp, which favors immediate, often brutal, quarantining based on observed symptoms, threatens to fracture New Providence even before the new threat emerges. This new manifestation of the virus, referred to chillingly by Vance's scouts as the Lurkers, is the film's thematic pivot. These infected aren't simply fast, they exhibit rudimentary pattern recognition. They wait in ambush positions near known supply routes. They utilize environmental cover, displaying a terrifying, almost intelligent patience. This forces Aris to confront the possibility that the virus isn't just a biological anomaly. It might be a rapid evolutionary process capitalizing on human complacency. Her initial inspiration, rooted in controlling known variables, buckles under the weight of this unpredictable, adapting enemy. The emotional core of their desperate journey to the defunct research station, deep within what was once a volatile exclusion zone, centers on their mutual reliance, despite their fundamentally opposed worldviews. Aris needs Vance's tactical genius to navigate the areas where the Lurkers congregate, offering the only real defense against an enemy that anticipates human movement. Vance, in turn, is forced to concede that kinetic force alone cannot solve a biological problem. He needs Aris's insight to predict where the next trap will be laid, understanding the pathogen's intent rather than just its immediate physical threat. The climax within the research station, a sterile, decaying monument to pre-fall hubris, is less a grand battle and more a surgical extraction under fire. Vance uses his knowledge of breaching techniques, learned perhaps from countless raids on hostile territories years ago, to carve a path to the main server room. Aris, meanwhile, uses a calculated environmental hazard, a sudden targeted release of a known irritant gas that temporarily disorients the Lurkers, based on her analysis of their modified respiratory systems, to create the necessary diversion. Their success is momentary, a fleeting victory predicated on the perfect, agonizing alignment of two completely different skill sets. As they escape, the final shot lingers not on their relief, but on the growing realization that the Lurkers are already adapting to the gas, their silence in the closing moments confirming that the fight isn't against a static enemy, but against the very concept of stagnation in the face of relentless biological pressure. The aftermath of their desperate raid on the research station leaves Aris and Vance deeply unsettled, the temporary success feeling more like a reprieve granted by a capricious fate than a true strategic advantage. Aris, clutching the salvaged data drive, a cold, hard repository of secrets that could save or doom New Providence, displays a tremor that wasn't purely physical. It was the shudder of a deeply held scientific belief system being fundamentally challenged. She begins to see the virus not as a disease to be cured, but as a relentless, self-optimizing system, forcing her to discard the textbook solutions that once guided her. Her demeanor shifts from fervent hope to a grim, almost fatalistic precision. The intellectual pursuit has become a matter of pure, harrowing necessity. Vance, having orchestrated their escape through a labyrinth of crumbling infrastructure, shows his own form of emotional expenditure. He rarely speaks of the close calls, the moments when a Lurker nearly breached his guard, but his body language screams of the toll. He starts relying less on established military protocol and more on Aris's terrifying biological insights. In one quiet scene, perhaps while maintaining watch during a scarce moment of rest, he confesses a small detail about his past, not a grand military achievement, but a failed containment operation early in his career where, following procedure, led to catastrophic loss of life. This memory clearly informs his current willingness to trust Aris's unconventional methods. He understands now that rigidity, even in the name of order, is just another form of vulnerability when the rules themselves change. Their return to New Providence is met with a mixture of elation and deep suspicion from the governing council, a group steeped in the bureaucratic inertia of trying to re-establish normalcy. The council members, often former middle management figures who thrived in the old world structure, view Aris's breakthrough data with skepticism, preferring the comfort of their established, albeit failing, quarantine measures. This political friction mirrors the internal struggle of the survivors, the desperate yearning for the predictable past versus the brutal necessity of accepting the radically altered present. The emotional climax of this segment arrives when the data reveals that the lurkers' enhanced intelligence isn't a random mutation, but a highly specific adaptation to human communication patterns. They are learning to anticipate troop movements based on the cadence of shouted commands and the rhythms of patrols. This realization shatters Vance's operational framework entirely. He recognizes the sound of his own voice, the very tools of his command, being weaponized against him. The silence he enforces becomes absolute, paranoid, and ultimately unsustainable for a community trying to function. The film uses the visual contrast effectively here. The sterile, data-filled glow of Aris's makeshift lab against the harsh, practical reality of Vance's perimeter defenses. As they attempt to implement a counter-strategy based on randomized, almost nonsensical communication signals, a system designed to confuse the lurkers' learned patterns, the tension is unbearable. It is the scientist forcing the soldier to abandon logic in favor of pure noise. The conclusion hints at the sheer exhaustion of perpetual crisis. When the randomized signals buy them enough time to secure a wider defensive perimeter, the victory is hollow. Aris and Vance stand side by side, not as allies bound by shared affection, but as two deeply scarred specialists who have found the absolute limit of their respective expertise. They have momentarily outsmarted an evolutionary opponent, but the final emotional beat is one of profound weariness. They understand that the next generation of the infected will have evolved past noise, perhaps towards interpreting sub-vocalized stress indicators or pheromonal changes. Survival, the narrative insists, isn't a linear path to peace. It's a continuous, mind-numbing cycle of adaptation, where every answer only breeds a more sophisticated question from the opposing force. The fragile truce forged between necessity and intellect begins to fray under the strain of enforced silence and the gnawing uncertainty of the lurker's next move. New Providence, having temporarily weathered the immediate threat, settles into a state of hyper-vigilant stasis, a condition almost as debilitating as active infection. Dr. Thorne finds herself increasingly isolated, not just by her esoteric work, but by the sheer psychological drain of constantly predicting biological innovation. Her research has devolved from seeking a cure to mapping the limits of adaptability, a pursuit that leaves her hollowed out. She begins to see patterns in the survivors themselves, the unconscious regression to tribalistic behavior, the small acts of hoarding, as just another, slower form of viral replication within the human psyche, a theme that undoubtedly resonated with the early, chaotic narratives of societal breakdown. Vance, meanwhile, has become a ghost of his former self, ruling the perimeter with near-total communication blackout. His reliance on nonverbal cues, hand signals, coded glances, has fostered an environment where paranoia thrives. The soldiers under his command, drawn from the hardened survivors of the outer settlements, begin to resent the leader who trusts data over direct experience, or worse, trusts only the unpredictable scientist. There are murmurs of dissent, small acts of insubordination, fueled by the desperate need to talk, to connect, even if that connection risks alerting the intelligent predators outside. Vance's past failure, the one he obliquely referenced, begins to replay in real time. His rigidity, intended to prevent chaos, is now actively breeding the very breakdown he fears. The film pivots again when a scouting team fails to return from a crucial mission near the old university sector, a known site of pre-outbreak virology research. It is not the loss of the team that triggers the major action, but the chilling lack of struggle reported by the last panicked transmission. The team simply stopped communicating, suggesting an ambush perfected beyond the lurkers' previous capabilities. This forces Aris and Vance into a final, terrifying confrontation with the implications of their enemy's rapid evolution. Aris realizes that the lurkers are not just reacting to human communication. They are learning to anticipate the hesitation that follows the breakdown of established patterns. The randomized signaling, meant to confuse them, has instead provided them with data on human fear responses under stress. Their investigation into the university sector reveals a devastating truth. The lurkers have begun utilizing rudimentary tools, not for complex construction, but for enhancing their ambush techniques, leveraging fallen debris to block exits or creating shallow trip hazards near defensible choke points. This discovery forces Vance to acknowledge that his martial expertise is rapidly becoming obsolete against an opponent whose learning curve is logarithmic. His inspiration, once drawn from discipline and tactical superiority, now must pivot to sheer, desperate improvisation, mirroring the chaotic innovation of the early days of the plague, only now layered with evolutionary intelligence. The emotional climax of this segment involves Aris and Vance being cornered within the university's decaying lecture hall. They are not fighting the infected in a direct confrontation, but are trapped while Aris frantically tries to upload a counter-agent concept derived from the university's records, a highly unstable biological marker designed to overload the lurkers' accelerated neural pathways. Vance, positioned at the main reinforced doors, must physically hold the line using methods entirely outside standard combat doctrine. He resorts to booby-trapping the entry points using chemicals Aris identifies as highly reactive to the lurker's new metabolic rate, effectively turning the environment itself into a reactive weapon. The resulting confrontation is messy, desperate, and relies on an almost symbiotic understanding forged in shared trauma. When the makeshift counter-agent finally deploys via the ventilation system, a sickly green vapor filling the hall, the immediate result is agonizing disorientation, but not total incapacitation. The final shot frames Vance and Aris, breathing heavily, watching the infected writhe in pain, a pain that seems to quickly transition into a new, unfamiliar stillness. They have bought time, perhaps, but the underlying dread is palpable. They have merely shown the lurkers another variable to solve for in the next iteration of their terrible survival game. The fallout from the university confrontation leaves Aris and Vance deeply unnerved by the sheer resilience of the adapted infected. The agonizing disorientation they witnessed was, to Aris's horror, a sign of rapid acclimatization rather than defeat. She pores over the neurological scans from the released marker, recognizing a pattern that mirrors accelerated neurological plasticity. The lurkers were not dying. They were rewriting their own response mechanisms in real time. This pushes Aris toward a terrifying conclusion, one that echoes the bleak philosophical undercurrents of existential survival literature. The virus is not just surviving humanity. It is actively learning the very principles of biological adaptation faster than humanity can articulate them. Her earlier inspiration, rooted in finding a cure, now seems laughably naive. The goal has shifted to creating an evolutionary dead end, a biological cul-de-sac. Vance, shaken by the near-fatal experience of relying on improvised, chemically reactive traps, begins to show visible signs of burnout. The perpetual tension of having to anticipate intelligent threats has eroded his iron discipline. He retreats further into himself, his tactical genius now clouded by a growing sense of futility. He starts viewing the very concept of security as an illusion, something only maintained through sheer, exhausting exertion. A quiet moment reveals him sharpening his field knife, not with the smooth, rhythmic strokes of a practiced soldier, but with a frantic, almost angry energy, as if trying to physically carve the chaos out of his own mind. He is haunted by the possibility that his decades of training in containing predictable threats are utterly useless against a foe that adapts faster than any human command structure can mobilize. The political situation in New Providence deteriorates rapidly. The council, witnessing the failure of Vance's enforced silence and Aris's volatile chemical solutions, votes to implement a return to older, more comforting protocols. Rigid rationing and stricter, visually based screening for infection, ignoring the data suggesting the new strain is asymptomatic for longer periods. This bureaucratic regression infuriates Aris, who sees the council willfully choosing comforting lies over deadly truths. She finds herself aligning almost entirely with Vance, not out of trust for his methods, but because he is the only other person in authority who understands the true velocity of the threat. Their bond solidifies into a shared understanding of impending doom, a grim partnership forged in mutual intellectual respect and shared terror. The narrative drives towards a final, desperate gambit when Aris deciphers a tertiary file from the university archives, a failed experiment detailing a pre-outbreak method for inducing controlled, accelerated cellular senescence, biological aging, in mammalian tissue using targeted viral triggers. It is a long shot, a dangerous manipulation of the very genetic code the virus is exploiting, but it represents the only known pathway to outpace the lurkers' adaptation by forcing their biology into premature decline. The final act centers on securing the necessary rare isotope required to stabilize this senescence trigger, located in a deep, subterranean government bunker that was supposedly purged years prior. Vance must navigate a network of old, abandoned tunnels, areas too cramped and structurally unsound for the lurkers' sophisticated ambush tactics, forcing him back into a reliance on pure, brute force navigation, a setting where his expertise still holds a slight, albeit temporary, advantage. The emotional payoff occurs during the extraction. Aris manages to synthesize a small, viable sample of the trigger agent. As they ascend from the bunker, they encounter a new wave of infected, not lurkers, but something yet unseen, exhibiting erratic, almost random movements, a biological reset, perhaps caused by the lingering effects of the university chemical release. Vance, seeing the sheer unpredictable nature of this third-generation threat, realizes that even the concept of intelligence might be too narrow a descriptor. He uses the last of his explosive charges not to clear a path, but to collapse the main tunnel entrance behind them, effectively trapping himself and Aris with the volatile trigger agent, sacrificing the certainty of the escape route for the slim possibility of neutralizing the entire outbreak cycle. The film closes as they activate the stabilization field around the isotope, surrounded by the unsettling silence of the newly reset infected, leaving the audience with the heavy realization that they have chosen the most difficult, most uncertain path to survival, not winning the battle, but destroying the rules of the war itself. The collapse of the bunker tunnel seals their fate, cementing the uneasy alliance between Aris and Vance in a claustrophobic, high-stakes environment. Vance's decision to detonate the charge was a profound emotional departure, a move away from calculated risk towards absolute commitment, born from the realization that incremental survival was no longer an option. He is visibly lighter, having shed the pretense of being able to meticulously manage every contingency. He now operates purely on instinct and Aris's often frighteningly accurate scientific predictions. His background in rapid, decisive military action finds its ultimate expression here, not in defeating an enemy, but in structurally severing their connection to the outside world, forcing a final confrontation on their own terms. Aris, meanwhile, is consumed by the preparation of the senescence trigger. The small, stabilized isotope is not just a chemical agent. It is the physical manifestation of her entire career, a gamble based on theories dismissed as too ethically fraught even before the initial collapse. She works with a terrifying focus, the low hum of the containment field providing a counterpoint to the heavy breathing of Vance, who stands guard, his massive frame blocking the narrow passage leading to the next, potentially infected layer of the facility. The inspiration here for Aris is less about historical science and more about sheer, desperate innovation under pressure, echoing the maverick inventors who built solutions from scraps when the system failed. The tertiary wave of infected, the resetters, proved to be the film's most psychologically challenging element. Lacking the terrifying intelligence of the lurkers or the blinding speed of the initial rage victims, their movements are spasmodic, chaotic, and seemingly without purpose. This ambiguity terrifies the survivors more than clear hostility. Vance observes them with detached fascination, noting that their behavior defies prediction based on past viral models. This forces Aris to admit that the constant evolutionary pressure has created a pathogen that cycles rapidly between states of calculated aggression and near catatonic randomness, making any sustained strategy obsolete within hours. Their main objective shifts from escaping the bunker to ensuring the successful deployment of the senescence trigger through the facility's legacy atmospheric controls, which Aris believes can disperse the agent throughout New Providence's immediate surrounding zones, targeting the dormant or less evolved infected as well. The moral weight of this decision is immense. They are releasing a mechanism designed to induce rapid biological decay, effectively playing God on a massive scale. Aris struggles with the ethical lines she is crossing, lines she once fiercely guarded, but the ghosts of the previous plagues push her forward. The cost of inaction, she reasons, is the extinction of viable humanity. The infiltration of the primary dispersal chamber is fraught with near misses, not against intelligent enemies, but against unpredictable environmental hazards amplified by the resetter's random stumbling that triggers structural collapses. Vance uses his intimate knowledge of obsolete, heavy engineering to jury-rig pathways, his movements less about precision combat and more about heavy, desperate physical endurance. In a moment of raw vulnerability, he admits to Aris that he feels safer here, underground, where the enemy's patterns are entirely dissolved, than back in New Providence, where human politics and complacency remain the most predictable killers. The final sequence is a quiet, almost ceremonial activation. As Aris initiates the sequence, flooding the chambers with the trigger agent, Vance stands beside her, his vigil complete. There is no immediate dramatic explosion of death. Instead, the external monitors show a gradual, unsettling slowing of movement across the monitored sectors. It is a biological deceleration, a forced evolutionary halt. The film does not offer them a triumphant escape or a reunion. Instead, Aris and Vance stare at the monitors, Two exhausted figures bathed in the sickly green glow of their dangerous success. Their final exchange is bleak. Eris notes that the agent will only delay the inevitable unless new understanding is gained. Vance simply nods, his eyes focused on the fading monitors, recognizing that they have merely reset the clock, forcing the next generation of survivors to confront a pathogen that will inevitably adapt to senescence itself. They have won a moment, purchased with ethical compromise and sheer willpower, leaving the audience with the lingering question: how many times can humanity rewrite the rules before the chaos itself becomes the final, unbeatable evolutionary stage? The deployment of the senescence trigger settles over the region, not with a bang, but with an eerie, protracted sigh. The visible world outside the bunker, as interpreted through the flickering, aged monitors, seems to fall into a heavy, unnatural slumber. Thorne watches the data streams detailing the infected's decelerated cellular processes, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. The triumph of scientific execution wars with the profound ethical trespass. She feels less like a savior and more like a cosmic vandal who has shattered a complex, albeit deadly, natural process. Her inspiration, once rooted in the meticulous pursuit of knowledge, has morphed into a grim appreciation for manipulating biological destiny itself. She understands that this solution is temporary, a sophisticated form of delaying tactics, and this knowledge weighs heavily on her, stripping away any lingering idealism. Commander Vance, positioned sentinel at the sealed doorway leading back toward the surface, finds a strange, temporary peace in the bunker's quiet finality. The immediate, intelligent threats have been chemically forced into a state of slow-motion decay, allowing him a respite from the constant need to predict malice. He surveys the confined space, the remnants of pre-fall technology, with a detached respect. His entire career was built on structure and containment. Now, surviving within the bowels of a failed bureaucratic machine, enforced by a radical biological intervention, feels almost ironically pure. He begins to clean his sidearm methodically, the rhythmic sound a comforting anchor against the unsettling quiet of the decelerated world outside. He realizes that the greatest service he provided was not fighting the infected, but trusting Eris enough to enact a plan that bypassed every known safety protocol he once championed. Their ascent back to the surface is slow, deliberate, and heavy with anticipation. They emerge into a world that feels fundamentally altered, quieter than before. The survivors in New Providence, having endured the Council's disastrous regression to old, visual screening methods, are now faced with the ambiguous results of the senescence agent. The infected outside the immediate blast radius are sluggish, moving with the stiff, arthritic gait of extreme age, yet they are still functioning. The Council's initial relief quickly curdles into confusion and resentment directed at Thorne and Vance, who return not as heroes bearing a cure, but as agents of further, incomprehensible change. The political schism deepens. The Council accuses Eris of unleashing an unknown biological weapon, while Vance is branded a rogue element for collaborating outside sanctioned authority. Eris counters their fear with data, explaining that the senescence effect is finite. The virus will eventually mutate around the forced aging mechanism, but the delay has bought them the time needed for her true research, the development of a targeted RNA interference agent derived from the initial university files, to mature. This requires resources the Council is unwilling to yield, viewing her continued work as an unnecessary risk when they could perhaps simply wait out the decelerated threat. The final devastating realization comes when a scout team manages to observe an infected individual who was heavily exposed to the senescence agent, but is now exhibiting unusual behavior. This individual, moving slowly, appears to be teaching the newer, unaffected infected how to mimic the slow movements, how to appear dormant until potential threats, like Vance's tactical patrols, pass by. The virus has not just mutated to resist aging, it has learned to weaponize dormancy and deception by observing the survivor's reactions to the slowing effect. This observation breaks the last vestiges of Eris's scientific detachment. She looks at Vance, her expression conveying a shared, profound sense of defeat. They have pushed evolution in one direction, and it has instantly adapted by incorporating their action into its survival toolkit. Vance doesn't need to speak. He understands. Their final moments together are not spent planning a new defense, but in a quiet, shared acknowledgement of the endless loop. As Auris gathers her few remaining samples, preparing to flee New Providence before the Council inevitably tries to contain her, Vance makes his final decision. He doesn't follow her. Instead, he moves back toward the perimeter defenses, an old soldier returning to a battle he knows he cannot win, but one he feels compelled to fight on familiar terms. He is preparing for a final stand against the slower, more deceptive threat, understanding that the greatest victory now is simply to slow the enemy's progress long enough for Auris to perhaps find a true sanctuary where her research can continue unhindered by political myopia or the enemy's terrifying learning curve. The film concludes not with the expected confrontation, but with Vance alone on the ramparts, his silhouette stark against the unnatural twilight, a stoic guardian against a threat that has learned not just to run, but to wait with infinite patience. The parting of Eris and Vance in the dying light of New Providence is etched with the quiet tragedy of indispensable, yet incompatible forms of survival. Vance's decision to remain was less a sacrifice and more a recognition of his obsolete skill set finding its final, most fitting application. Buying time through sheer, stubborn opposition. He chose the recognizable theater of battle, the perimeter, believing his brute force defense would offer the only immediate impedance against the dormant phase, infected, those learning to feign decay. His last gesture toward Auris, a curt nod acknowledging the necessity of her flight, speaks volumes about a man who found meaning only in the immediate execution of duty, regardless of ultimate outcome. Auris escapes New Providence under the cloak of the infected's sluggish behavior, taking only the essential cryo-storage units containing the nascent RNA interference agent and the core data sets. Her departure is solitary, devoid of the kinetic energy of the previous escapes. It is the slow, careful withdrawal of a scientist protecting the last viable sample of hope. She travels toward the rumored remnants of a centralized, underground research facility, known only through fragmented pre-fall communications, a place where true isolation might finally allow her work to proceed without the interference of panicked governance or the enemy's rapid counter-adaptations. Her inspiration shifts entirely. She is no longer trying to save this iteration of humanity, but to engineer a solution for the next one, acknowledging the cyclical nature of their suffering. The journey itself becomes a testament to the pervasive nature of the virus's evolutionary pressure. Auris encounters small, isolated pockets of survivors who have organized around bizarre, self-imposed rules designed to counteract the perceived threat. Some communities only communicate through singing, believing sound vibrations disrupt the learned pattern recognition. Others have reverted to agrarian simplicity, avoiding complex tools altogether for fear of being mimicked. These fragmented societies serve as chilling case studies for Eris, illustrating the myriad, often self-destructive, ways humanity attempts to impose order onto chaos. She observes these failed experiments with a detached clinical interest, recognizing the desperate need for narrative control overriding actual biological reality. The narrative focuses intensely on the development of the RNA agent. In the deep isolation of the underground facility, Aris faces a new adversary: mechanical failure and the degradation of ancient infrastructure. She is forced to become not only a virologist, but also a mechanical engineer, scavenging for functioning centrifuges and stable power sources. This environment forces her to rely on the practical ingenuity she always disdained, blending it with her abstract knowledge. The breakthrough arrives when she realizes the key to stabilizing the RNA agent lies not in sophisticated pre-fall technology, but in mimicking the self-repair mechanisms evident in the original, aggressive rage strain. A horrifying irony where the cure must borrow elements from the disease's most successful iteration. The film crescendos as Aris prepares the first large-scale deployment of the RNA agent, an airborne dispersal designed to target the specific genetic markers responsible for the accelerated adaptation seen in the lurkers and dormant phase. As she initiates the launch sequence, a final, crushing piece of recovered data illuminates the screen. The senescence agent, while slowing the infected, inadvertently created the necessary evolutionary pressure for the next stage. A hyper-adaptive entity that learns not just from human behavior, but from the very cures deployed against it. The ending offers no final resolution. Aris watches the dispersal metrics climb, knowing she has just initiated the creation of the fourth, unknown strain. She has acted decisively, breaking every ethical barrier, yet the result is not victory, but merely another turn of the screw. She walks out of the dispersal chamber, leaving the activated equipment behind, her face devoid of hope or despair, only profound weariness. The final shot is not of Aris, but of the landscape outside the facility after the agent is released, the air shimmering almost imperceptibly, suggesting not immediate infection, but a deep, invisible restructuring of the viral biology, waiting for the survivors to make their next predictable move. The story closes on the terrifying realization that the conflict is not between man and virus, but between reaction and exponential adaptation. The final images of Aris walking away from her desperate creation reinforce a central thesis of this chapter. Survival in this reality is defined by acceleration, not conquest. She is a shadow now, the dedicated epidemiologist, subsumed by the necessity of perpetual reinvention. Her inspiration has calcified into a cold, pragmatic drive to out-engineer an opponent whose only constant is change. She carries no sense of heroism, only the crushing burden of knowledge, the knowledge that every attempted fix becomes the blueprint for the next disaster. Her journey outward from the facility is not one of escape, but of seeking a new, even more remote laboratory where she might anticipate the consequences of her own intervention. The fourth iteration of the infected, theorized by Aris to be a strain that weaponizes resistance to anti-adaptation measures, remains unseen but deeply felt. The world is now defined by absence, the absence of predictable movement, the absence of reliable metrics. The scattered communities Aris previously observed, those trying to communicate through song or avoid technology, have likely been consumed by this new, stealthy adversary that likely mimics established forms of survival, blending seamlessly into pockets of fragile human order. Aris encounters a lone, heavily damaged drone in the ruins of a high-altitude communications tower, a relic of the pre-fall era. Its corrupted operational logs offer a final, bitter insight. The logs detail not attacks, but surveillance reports from automated systems that were observing the very first stages of the original rage outbreak. What Aris sees documented is chillingly familiar to Vance's early tactical fears, The initial infected moved rapidly, but the second wave displayed an uncanny ability to learn from the mistakes made by the first responders. They learned to avoid open ground, to target communication hubs. The deep irony is that the virus's initial success was built on a primitive form of learning, and every subsequent generation has merely refined that capacity. Her true emotional climax occurs not in a moment of action, but during a forced stop in a deserted, overgrown library. She finds a heavily annotated copy of Darwin's On the Origin of Species, left open on a reading stand, perhaps by a scholar who never made it out. The underlined passages speak of selection pressure and environmental fitness. Aris sees her entire struggle reflected there. The virus is not malevolent. It is simply perfectly adapted to the environment she creates. This realization is the closest she comes to breaking down, the intellectual surrender to the relentless truth of natural selection operating at terrifying speed. She closes the book, her face grimly resolved. The only way to win is to remove the selection pressure, which means perhaps removing the host capable of accelerating the process, humanity itself, or at least its chaotic, reactionary elements. Her final actions are shrouded in deliberate ambiguity. She uses the drone's communication array, powered by scavenged batteries, to send a single, highly encrypted burst transmission. It is not a message to any potential survivors, but a massive data dump, the synthesis of all her work, the documentation of the 4 stages, and the stark mathematical probability that the next strain will be virtually undetectable. She sends it into the deep, dark corners of the old global network, a message cast adrift without a guaranteed recipient, a final act of scientific duty divorced from the flawed context of immediate survival. The film ends with Eris continuing her walk into the vast, silent expanse. She is no longer the scientist seeking a cure, nor the survivor fleeing danger. She is the repository of catastrophic knowledge, moving toward an unknown, perhaps self-imposed, exile. The camera lingers on the vast, empty landscape, punctuated only by the slow, irregular twitching of a few distant, infected forms, the embodiment of the 4th, unknowable threat. There is no sense of closure, only the chilling continuity of biological pressure, leaving the audience with the distinct impression that the story did not end. It simply entered a phase too complex for the current generation to observe or influence. The lingering dread that permeated Danny Boyle's original 28 Days Later finds a potent, if perhaps overly polished, resurgence in 28 Years Later. This continuation, set squarely in a recognizable, yet deeply scarred post-outbreak Britain, leans heavily into the established iconography while attempting to grapple with the generational trauma that 2 decades of isolation and survival have wrought. The film wisely eschews the notion of a clean cure, instead presenting a world where the rage virus remains an endemic, evolutionary threat, a persistent feature of the ecosystem rather than a dramatic inciting incident. The narrative pivots around a new generation, those born after the initial collapse, who have only known a world policed by remnants of the military, or controlled by fiercely self-sufficient, often ruthless, enclaves. The atmosphere immediately recalls the stark, brutalist aesthetics favored by contemporary survival cinema, but infused with a distinctly British sensibility of damp decay and faded grandeur. One of the film's strengths lies in its production design, showcasing London not as rubble-strewn wasteland, but as a place slowly being reclaimed by nature, the overgrown familiarity making the sudden bursts of violence all the more jarring. Central to the emotional core is the performance of Anya Sharma, playing Ilara, a young archivist obsessed with retrieving pre-outbreak cultural artifacts, viewing them as anchors to a lost civilization. Her journey mirrors, in a refracted way, the early determination of characters like Jim in the first film, but filtered through a lens of historical reverence rather than immediate panic. Sharma, relatively unknown before this role, carries the weight of historical memory effectively, embodying the fatigue of inheriting a broken legacy. Director Maria Flores, whose previous work focused on intimate, character-driven dramas set against political upheaval, brings a welcome focus on the psychological toll. Flores avoids the temptation to simply replicate the kinetic energy of Boyle's initial vision, opting instead for long, unnerving sequences emphasizing quiet desperation and the constant, low-level threat of infection. The film is not entirely free of its influences. There is a clear nod to the gritty realism of the road, particularly in the sequences depicting travel across the desolate north of England. However, where Cormac McCarthy's work is defined by existential despair, 28 years later attempts to inject a sliver of organized hope, embodied by a secretive scientific community established in the Outer Hebrides, reminiscent of the idealized communities explored in early post-apocalyptic literature. This subplot, while necessary for narrative progression, feels somewhat less convincing than the grounded horror of the main narrative thread in England. The infected themselves have evolved. They are faster, perhaps smarter in their group coordination, a clear escalation designed to raise the stakes beyond mere sprinting zombies. The true artistic success of the film lies in its commentary on societal restructuring. We witness the emergence of cults centered on the purity of pre-outbreak DNA and the horrifying militarization of resources. A particularly chilling sequence involves a confrontation with a settlement that has instituted draconian laws based on distorted interpretations of public health mandates from the initial collapse, suggesting that fear, not just the virus, is the most enduring pathogen. The score, avoiding a slavish imitation of John Murphy's iconic techno-driven heartbeat, instead utilizes dissonant strings and deep ambient noise, reflecting a world where rhythm is defined by anxiety rather than urgency. Ultimately, 28 years later, functions as a mature reflection on endurance. It acknowledges that survival isn't about conquering the threat, but about learning to live within its permanent shadow. While it occasionally stumbles when reaching for epic scope, it remains compelling due to its sharp focus on characters trying to construct meaning from the ruins, a theme that echoes the best moments of late 20th century dystopian filmmaking. The emotional resonance of this sequel hinges significantly on the portrayal of resilience in the face of systemic decay. Liam Hayes, as Marcus, the weary, disillusioned former Royal Marine, tasked with protecting Ilara's archival expeditions, provides the necessary grounding cynicism. Hayes, whose prior roles often involved playing stoic figures, broken by bureaucratic failures, a theme visible in his intense performance in the independent thriller The Thin Blue Line, brings a deep weariness to Marcus. He doesn't believe in grand resurrections. His hope is measured only in the next few meters of secure travel. Marcus views Ilara's fixation on history not as noble, but as dangerously naive, contrasting sharply with the pragmatic, brutal ethos required for daily existence outside the fortified zones. This tension between preserving memory and ensuring immediate survival is the film's most potent driver. The visual language consistently underscores this conflict. Flores's direction often frames characters small against the vast, silent landscapes of abandoned infrastructure. There are long shots of empty motorways choked with vegetation, where the only movement is the slow drift of debris, evoking a profound sense of temporal displacement. These scenes deliberately contrast with the frantic, close-quarters combat sequences, which retain the visceral immediacy that defined the franchise's early success. When the infected attack, the camera suddenly snaps into a handheld, almost suffocating proximity, throwing the viewer back into the panicked subjectivity of the first film, but now overlaid with the grim awareness that escape is less about fleeing a temporary catastrophe and more about surviving a perpetual state of war. The psychological profile of the primary antagonists, the remnants of the organized military faction known as the Regulators, is fascinatingly complex. They aren't just power-hungry warlords. They are individuals pathologically clinging to the structure they believe saved them. Their leader, portrayed by veteran character actor Alistair Finch, famous for his nuanced portrayals of compromised authority figures, is meticulous to the point of madness. Finch imbues the Regulator with the chilling conviction of a man who genuinely believes his oppressive control is the only thing preventing societal reversion to the savage state. His methods, which involve forced sterilization programs meant to control population growth in their small, arable territories, present a bleak extrapolation of early pandemic control measures, suggesting that the architecture of fear outlives the immediate threat. Furthermore, the film subtly explores the evolution of the virus itself, not just biologically, but socially. The narrative hints that prolonged isolation has led to the formation of small territorial groups among the infected, suggesting a rudimentary form of social learning within the rage state. This elevation from purely instinctual terror to coordinated threat forces, characters like Marcus to adapt tactics beyond simple avoidance, demanding a level of tactical ingenuity reminiscent of early military strategy games, an area where Marcus's background proves invaluable, albeit reluctantly applied. The film avoids easy answers, showing that adaptation to the new world means accepting compromises that would have been morally unthinkable 28 years prior. The quiet moments, the shared rations, the unspoken acknowledgement of necessary brutality, these are the true markers of survival age, far more telling than any explosive set piece. The film further develops the emotional landscape through the character of Dr. Lena Petrova, the lead scientist at the Hebridean Sanctuary. Petrova, played by Isabella Rossi, who built her early career portraying brilliant but emotionally stunted intellectuals in European art house thrillers, embodies the conflict between scientific detachment and human empathy. Her dedication to finding a true immunological solution often puts her at odds with the pragmatic security concerns of the colony's elders. Rossi masterfully conveys the fragility beneath Petrova's rigorous professionalism. Her hands, frequently shown manipulating delicate lab equipment, betray a constant tremor, a physical manifestation of the burden of holding the world's last hope for true eradication. Her emotional arc is driven by the ghost of failure, a memory, subtly alluded to, of a miscalculated risk in the immediate aftermath of the initial outbreak that cost countless lives, fueling her current, almost obsessive need for meticulous certainty. This scientific quest directly contrasts with the visceral, immediate world inhabited by Ilara and Marcus. Ilara's interactions with Petrova are fraught with generational misunderstanding. Where Ilara seeks context and historical grounding, a way to understand why they lost the world, Petrova is only interested in the how of rebuilding it biologically. Ilara's youth allows her a certain reckless optimism derived from ignorance of the worst atrocities, whereas Marcus carries the acute memory of the initial collapse, coloring every interaction with suspicion. When Marcus sees Petrova's elaborate containment protocols, he doesn't see science. He sees another, more sophisticated form of the very isolation that first doomed civilization. Visually, Flores uses light and shadow to articulate these diverging worldviews. The Hebrides sequences are bathed in a cold, almost sterile blue light, emphasizing the artificiality and fragility of the sanctuary's order. Conversely, the scenes tracking Marcus and Alara through the ruins of the Midlands are dominated by the murky, brown-green tones of decay and encroaching wilderness, where sunlight struggles to penetrate the dense overgrowth. This dichotomy suggests that intellectual control, Petrova's domain, is inherently less sustainable than adaptive barbarism, Marcus's domain, in this new ecological reality. The recurring motif is the broken pane of glass, shattered windows everywhere, symbolizing the shattered illusion of protective barriers, whether they are physical, political, or scientific. The narrative cleverly avoids the typical chosen one trope by positioning Alara not as a savior, but as a chronicler. Her primary motivation is not to defeat the virus, but to ensure that if humanity fails again, the story of its fall is accurately recorded. This shift in focus from heroic action to archival responsibility provides a melancholic weight to the film's final third. The emotional peak is not a major battle, but a quiet moment where Marcus finally allows Alara to show him a recovered, intact children's picture book from before the rage. In that shared, silent recognition of lost innocence, the film finds its most profound statement: that even in a world ruled by evolved savagery, the desperate human need to remember beauty is the last vestige of civilization worth fighting for. The film's exploration of evolved societal structures takes a dark turn when the narrative forces Marcus and Alara into direct, unavoidable contact with the remnants of the old government's security apparatus, specifically a highly decentralized network referred to only as the Directorate. This group is not interested in rebuilding society as much as optimizing its own survival through extreme resource hoarding and information control. Director Flores uses the introduction of the Directorate to dissect the corrosive nature of legacy power structures under duress. These antagonists are characterized by their meticulous bureaucracy, maintaining handwritten ledgers and rigid adherence to pre-fall operational manuals, even when those manuals actively hinder their survival in the post-rage landscape. The embodiment of this flawed system is Commander Thorne, a character whose chilling normalcy is perhaps the film's most terrifying element. Thorne, unlike the overtly savage regulators, operates with the calm, dispassionate logic of mid-level management executing unpopular but necessary corporate policy. We learn through subtle background exposition, dossiers Alara manages to decrypt, that Thorne was a security analyst specializing in risk mitigation before the outbreak, a career path that perfectly prepared him for the cold calculus of post-apocalyptic dominance. His motivation is not ideological purity, but procedural adherence. He executes horrific acts, like abandoning entire non-compliant settlements to the infected, because the internal protocols dictate maximizing efficiency for the core Directorate assets. The conflict with the Directorate becomes less about viral containment and more about ideological warfare, the right to autonomy versus the perceived necessity of total centralized control. The ensuing confrontations are staged not in open fields, but within the hollowed-out shells of former administrative centers, government buildings, data centers, and forgotten archives, places where the symbols of order have become the symbols of tyranny. These environments allow for tense, claustrophobic sequences where the threat is not just the swift violence of the infected, but the methodical oppression of men convinced they are the rightful inheritors of order. This pressure forces Marcus to confront his own past trauma, revealing subtle flashbacks that hint at his involvement in the initial martial law crackdowns, suggesting his current cynicism stems from participating in the very systems he now fights against. His reluctance to embrace any form of centralized authority is thus recontextualized. It is not mere weariness, but profound guilt. The film handles these moments of character introspection with brutal economy, often using the reflection in a dusty window or the glare off polished steel to signify a moment of inescapable self-reckoning. The emotional weight shifts from protecting Elara to seeking a redemption that he feels inherently undeserved, a far more complex trajectory than simple heroism. The final act against the Directorate is thus framed as a desperate, personal attempt to burn down the institutions he once helped build, hoping something genuinely new might grow from the ashes. The exploration of the Directorate's rigidly controlled environment serves as a potent foil to the fragile, almost organic community that Elara and Marcus eventually seek out, a rumored collective operating beyond the established zones known only as the Freeholders. This group represents the true unknown variable in the post-Rage world, rumored to have successfully integrated survival strategies that deliberately shun both the technological dogma of Petrova's sanctuary and the authoritarian control of the Directorate. Their existence fuels Elara's hope, representing a genuine societal reinvention rather than mere survival of the fittest or preservation of the past. The journey to the Freeholders, which forms the backbone of the film's climactic third act, requires traversing territories dominated by the evolved infected in ways that demand total sensory deprivation and strategic silence. Flores heightens the tension here by introducing a unique environmental factor. Areas saturated with a chemical runoff from defunct industrial sites, which seems to temporarily dull the infected's hyperacute senses, forcing the protagonists to rely on a near-supernatural stillness. Marcus excels in these sections, his military training demanding absolute control over breath and micro-movements, transforming him from a weary protector into a lethal shadow. His quiet confidence in these desolate zones is striking. He is finally operating on a playing field where the rules, however deadly, are consistent and predictable, unlike the shifting political landscapes of the human factions. The introduction of the Freeholders themselves is handled with masterful ambiguity. When Elara and Marcus finally reach them, they find not a utopia, but a highly functional, deeply integrated commune that has adopted a profoundly non-hierarchical structure. There are no designated leaders. Decisions are made through consensus, built on shared immediate risk assessment. One of the key Freeholder figures, a matriarch named Mara, whose backstory hints at her having been a brilliant, disillusioned urban planner who abandoned Seattle years before the outbreak, articulates their philosophy. We don't conserve, we regenerate. Conservation implies something was lost. We assume nothing was given, only taken. Her presence challenges Elara's archival obsession directly. Mara argues that focusing on the past prevents the necessary formation of the new. The emotional core of this final segment revolves around Marcus's slow, painful thawing. Seeing a system that functions without the need for his brutal expertise forces him to question his entire identity as a survivor defined by violence. In a quiet scene inside the Freeholders' hydroponics bay, illuminated by soft, artificial growth lights, Marcus drops his weapon for the first time since the opening sequence. This gesture, small as it is, signifies the potential for post-traumatic peace. The film suggests that true survival is not about defeating the virus or mastering human enemies, but finding a place where the mechanisms of perpetual defense can finally be laid down, even if the external threat remains an eternal feature of the world. The lingering, understated emotion is not triumph, but a fragile, earned respite before the inevitable next confrontation with the world outside their green sanctuary. The culmination of these ideological clashes, the Directorate's sterile control, Petrova's scientific isolation, and the freeholders' adaptive organicism sets the stage for the film's denouement, which wisely refuses to offer a decisive victory over the rage virus. Instead, the climax focuses on the synthesis of survival strategies forced by an escalating external crisis, a massive coordinated migration of the infected driven by changes in environmental conditions, perhaps cyclical weather patterns or seismic activity unsettling hibernation zones. This forces an uneasy temporary alliance between Alara, Marcus, Petrova's scientific team, and elements of the freeholders. This forced collaboration is where the nuanced character arcs pay their greatest dividends. Petrova, initially resistant to engaging with the unscientific pragmatism of the freeholders, is forced to accept their low-tech solutions for rapid pathogen detection when her high-tech sensors fail amid electromagnetic interference caused by the migrating horde. Isabella Rossi portrays Petrova's concession not as defeat, but as a profound intellectual humility, a recognition that pure knowledge must yield to applied wisdom under extreme duress. Her trembling hands, once symbols of scientific anxiety, now steady as she improvises filtration systems using materials sourced from the freeholders' regenerative stores. Marcus, now fighting alongside the freeholders, finds himself in the paradoxical position of being the group's primary offensive asset, while simultaneously learning their philosophy of minimal engagement. His combat style shifts from reactive defense to calculated attrition. He moves with the efficiency of a seasoned warrior, but avoids the gratuitous violence that characterized his interactions with the regulators. There is a moment where he chooses to disable, rather than execute, a leading infected creature demonstrating anomalous tactical awareness, an action that mirrors the freeholders' policy of understanding rather than merely destroying. This indicates a profound internal shift. Marcus is moving beyond reaction and toward proactive, ethical strategy. Alara's role becomes pivotal, not as a warrior or scientist, but as the cultural bridge. She uses her knowledge of pre-fall communications infrastructure, which the Directorate had dismissed as obsolete, to transmit crucial, real-time data about the infected migration patterns gathered by Petrova's adapted sensors to other scattered enclaves. She becomes the conduit, proving that the past's knowledge, properly contextualized, is essential for navigating the present chaos. Her quiet triumph lies in making historical knowledge directly actionable, satisfying her initial quest for relevance. The film concludes not with a scene of eradication, but with dispersal. The temporary alliance fractures organically once the immediate migration threat passes. Petrova chooses to return to her sanctuary, newly enlightened on the necessity of community integration. Marcus, having found a form of internal peace through meaningful action rather than mere survival, chooses to remain with the freeholders, his deep-seated cynicism finally tempered by tangible proof that non-violent, equitable systems can function, however precarious they are. The final shot lingers on the overgrown London skyline, no longer a symbol of total loss, but a vast, complex landscape where numerous, small pockets of humanity, different in ideology, but unified by the necessity of ongoing adaptation, continue to exist. The message is clear. The 28-year saga is not about overcoming the plague, but about learning the infinite, nuanced ways humanity can choose to live within its shadow. The ambiguous, open-ended conclusion intentionally pivots the franchise's focus from the spectacle of immediate apocalypse to the long, quiet struggle of ideological endurance, setting the conceptual stage for a potential follow-up, perhaps titled 28 Decades Later. This framing device allows the film to transition the narrative weight from kinetic survival horror to a more subdued anthropological study of post-collapse cultures. The essential drama is no longer whether the virus can be cured, but which form of human organization will prove most resilient against the backdrop of persistent, low-level viral threat and ecological instability. The potential for future installments is subtly seeded through the fate of Commander Thorne and the Directorate. While Marcus defeated the immediate operational cells, the final moments implied that the Directorate's decentralized procedural mindset, its very faith in paper trails and rigid hierarchy, has survived the physical confrontation. Thorne himself is not captured or killed on screen. Rather, he is last seen activating a series of encrypted, automated data drops before vanishing into the less controlled northern territories. This suggests that the ideology of control, stripped of its physical infrastructure, has merely gone underground, morphing into a digital or ideologically purist resistance movement ready to reassert dominance when fear inevitably spikes again. This sets up a fascinating future conflict, a war not against flesh-and-blood antagonists, but against the seductive logic of totalitarian order. Furthermore, the evolutionary trajectory of the infected remains tantalizingly unresolved. The film only showed a temporary coherence during the migration event. The ambiguity suggests that the virus itself may be participating in an evolutionary arms race with humanity. If human communities are developing greater cooperation, like the freeholders, the infected might develop further levels of organized, perhaps even adaptive communication, moving beyond rudimentary group behavior to something closer to a decentralized, biological network. Future analysis could explore the possibility of localized viral intelligence, where different geographical strains exhibit unique behavioral patterns based on the environment they have adapted to over decades. The emotional residue left by the film is one of mature fatigue rather than youthful adrenaline. The characters who survive do so not because they are the fastest or the strongest, but because they are the most adaptable in their worldview. Alara, having bridged the gap between history and action, is positioned not as a future leader, but as a necessary historian for the next generation of fledgling communities. Her quiet competence ensures that the lessons learned, the necessity of both data preservation and immediate ground-level cooperation, will not be lost to the inevitable cycles of fear and forgetting that haunt human civilization. 28 years later, functions as a powerful mediation on the long aftermath, firmly establishing that the true horror of the rage was not the initial panic, but the permanent restructuring of human morality required to live in its long, gray dawn. The enduring power of the film lies in its refusal to sanitize the psychological costs of prolonged survival, moving beyond the visceral shock of the initial outbreak to examine the subtle ways human connection itself becomes a hazardous commodity. The relationship between Marcus and Alara, forged in immediate danger, undergoes a crucial test within the relative safety of the freeholders. Once the threat of the migrating infected subsides, the everyday necessity of vulnerability forces a reckoning. Marcus, accustomed to a world defined by zero-sum exchanges, survival or death, struggles profoundly with the freeholders' ethos of mutual reliance. His discipline, honed through years of necessary brutality, manifests as an almost pathological need to remain on the perimeter, viewing the communal sleeping arrangements and shared resources as structural weaknesses waiting to be exploited by either the Directorate or the remnants of the Rage. This internal conflict is externalized through subtle character moments. There is a recurring scene where Marcus meticulously sharpens his preferred combat knife, even when the freeholders have presented him with simpler, more utilitarian tools for foraging and building. The act of sharpening becomes a ritualistic clinging to his old identity, the identity that kept him alive when Petrova's science failed and the Directorate's order betrayed. Alara notices this, not with judgment, but with the detached understanding of an observer who now sees the deep roots of trauma. She understands that Marcus doesn't just fear the outside world, he fears the man he might become if he ever fully relaxes his guard within the sanctuary. The film subtly incorporates the notion of inherited anxiety through the younger members of the Freeholders, those born entirely into the post-Rage world. They exhibit a peculiar blend of resourcefulness and deep-seated emotional flatness. They can repair complex pre-fall machinery using scavenged parts with remarkable ingenuity. Yet they possess almost no capacity for abstract joy or sustained introspection. A poignant scene involves one of these younger freeholders attempting to replicate a piece of music Ilara found on a damaged audio file. The result is technically accurate, but utterly devoid of feeling, a perfect metaphor for a generation capable of maintaining the mechanics of civilization, but disconnected from its soul. This suggests that the trauma is not just biological, carried in the survival instinct, but cultural, passed down through the absence of genuine emotional scaffolding. Ultimately, 28 years later, leaves the audience with the unsettling realization that the true antagonist is not a virus or a tyrant, but the inertia of learned despair. The film suggests that rebuilding requires more than just food and shelter. It requires the conscious, daily rejection of the survival dogma that defined the previous 2 decades. The slow, deliberate pace of the final sequences, devoid of explosive action, underscores this thematic requirement. The hardest fight in a world redefined by catastrophe is the internal one, the persistent choice to invest in a future that has no guarantees against the siren call of cynical self-preservation. The philosophical weight of this sustained quiet struggle is further intensified by the film's masterful handling of scarcity, which extends beyond physical resources into the realm of information and emotional authenticity. The Directorate's obsession with controlling historical data, believing that the narrative of collapse must serve their vision of the future, clashes directly with the freeholders' radical transparency. This dichotomy is personified in the narrative's treatment of salvage technology. Where the Directorate painstakingly maintained massive, climate-controlled server farms filled with encrypted records they deemed essential for future governance, a tribute to Alistair Finch's Thorne's administrative fervor, the freeholders rely on incredibly localized, low-energy forms of knowledge transfer, primarily oral tradition, and highly contextualized sketches based on direct observation. This contrast forces a critical examination of what constitutes value in a collapsed state. When Ilara attempts to upload some of her archival data to a freeholder hub, a network built on solar-charged, low-frequency radio relays, she finds that much of her meticulously cataloged information on pre-fall economics and international law is treated as utterly irrelevant noise. Mara, the freeholder matriarch, expresses this view gently but firmly. We do not need to know the Dow Jones average to know when the rains will come. We need to know the moss. This radical prioritization of immediate, empirical knowledge over abstract historical continuity deeply challenges Ilara's carefully constructed worldview, forcing her to confront the possibility that her devotion to the before time is a form of cultural escapism, a refusal to fully inhabit the present ruin. The emotional cost of this reassessment is particularly visible in the evolving dynamic between Ilara and Dr. Petrova. Initially, allies based on a shared, if differently motivated, belief in preserving human potential. Their Bond phrase when Petrova sees the freeholders intentionally destroy a functional but energy-inefficient pre-fall water purification unit, replacing it with a series of communal, gravity-fed collection troughs. Petrova views this as regression, a willful discarding of technological advantage. Rossi plays Petrova's distress as genuine grief over lost potential, interpreting the destruction as symptomatic of a civilization that has simply given up on true progress. This argument brings the core theme of the film to a head. Is progress defined by technological advancement and control, or by sustainable, adaptable integration with the environment, even if it means sacrificing complexity? The final, unspoken layer of character exploration concerns the nature of forgiveness. Marcus, having witnessed both the institutional betrayals of the Directorate and the moral compromises required for his own survival, finally finds a space, the Freeholders, where he is not required to be the executioner or the warden. His slow integration involves learning to trust in Mara's belief that past failures do not entirely dictate future capacity. The film suggests that true societal recovery begins not with curing a pathogen, but with curing the deep-seated human need for absolute control that the pathogen merely exploited. The lingering image of Marcus tending to the garden alongside the younger generation, his massive frame now engaged in quiet, constructive labor, signifies that the most enduring mutation in the 28-year timeline is the human capacity, however scarred, to choose gentle responsibility over violent dominance. The lingering tension concerning the Directorate's ideological remnants necessitates a final narrative confrontation that is less a physical battle and more a philosophical siege against the encroaching narrative of fear. As the Freeholders begin to establish tentative, decentralized communication with other small, successful enclaves, a process facilitated by Alara's adapted tech, the Directorate, operating from hidden, hardened bunkers, likely stocked with forgotten Cold War-era contingency plans, attempts a strategic sabotage. This act is not aimed at mass casualty, but at fracturing nascent trust. They deploy carefully curated, manufactured data packets through salvaged radio frequencies designed to mimic evidence of freeholder betrayal or Petrova's sanctuary selling out its immune subjects to outsiders. This information warfare highlights the evolved threat. The enemy no longer needs to sprint. It needs only to whisper convincing lies into the fragile network of new communities. Alistair Finch's Thorn, though physically absent, exerts his influence through these digital traps, proving that his organizational mindset was his true weapon. The narrative tension peaks as several recipient enclaves begin to mobilize defensively against the Freeholders based on this spurious intelligence. Marcus is faced with a critical choice: resort to his proven, violent methods to physically intercept the broadcast source, or trust in the slow, consensus-driven process of transparent debunking advocated by Mara and Ilara. Marcus chooses the latter, a move that signifies his complete internal rehabilitation. Instead of leading an assault, he facilitates a rapid, encrypted communication line directly between the targeted enclaves and the Freeholders, bypassing the conventional broadcast towers that Thorn controls. Ilara champions this by providing historical context on how wartime propaganda functions, using examples from forgotten 20th century conflicts to expose the pattern of the Directorate's manipulation. This reliance on verifiable context over reactive force demonstrates the maturation of the survivors. They are building societal immune systems based on critical thinking rather than mere biological immunity. The climax of this ideological conflict is quiet but devastating for Thorn's doctrine. When the enclaves verify the data as counterfeit, often by cross-referencing small, verifiable truths known only to them, the decentralized network ignores the Directorate's fabricated narratives, effectively isolating the remnants of the old system into irrelevance. The final shot relating to this thread shows a remote Directorate bunker being quietly decommissioned, not by military force, but by the simple abandonment of its protocols. Without anyone to enforce or believe in the rigid structure, the bunker becomes a tomb of obsolete paperwork. This resolution solidifies the film's ultimate thesis. In the long aftermath, the most dangerous infection is the institutional memory of authoritarian control. Survival is not a matter of physical prowess against the infected, but a continuous, conscious effort to build social structures resistant to the psychological pull of fear-based governance. 28 years later, concludes by showing that the world has moved beyond simply living, despite the rage. It is now engaged in the painstaking, ongoing construction of a better, more honest human society because of it. The true measure of the freeholder's success and the subtle emotional reward for the audience lies in the film's depiction of cultural synthesis and the creation of new, albeit fragile, rites of passage. As the immediate threat of Directorate sabotage recedes, the focus shifts inward to the necessary process of weaving the disparate survivor philosophies, Petrova's scientific rigor, Alara's reverence for history, and Marcus's hard-won pragmatic ethics, into a cohesive, functioning whole. This synthesis is symbolized by the construction of a shared memorial site, a deliberate act designed to honor the dead without paralyzing the living. The memorial construction becomes the locus for the final deep character interactions. Dr. Petrova, initially skeptical of ceremonies she deems scientifically inefficient, finds herself contributing by painstakingly cataloging and preserving genetic samples from the deceased, a scientific homage to the lives lost, ensuring that if an eradication cure is ever found, the sacrifices are not in vain. Isabella Rossi portrays this as a quiet atonement. She is finally learning to value memory, not just as data, but as legacy. Marcus's role in this process is transformative. He is instrumental in the physical construction, utilizing his knowledge of load-bearing structures learned during the early, desperate days of fortification. Yet, unlike his previous defensive actions, this labor is collaborative and future-oriented. He works alongside the younger freeholders, teaching them not just how to build walls, but how to build something meant to last beyond the immediate crisis. The most telling detail is his interaction with the young man who previously struggled with music. Marcus, using Alara's archived historical data on musical notation, helps the youth understand the emotional intent behind the sound, bridging the gap between technical replication and authentic expression. This suggests Marcus has finally found a constructive application for his disciplined intensity, nurturing the human spirit he once only knew how to protect with violence. Alara, meanwhile, transitions fully into her role as the designated chronicler of the New Covenant. She doesn't merely record events. She actively mediates between the older survivors haunted by the pre-fall world, like Marcus and Petrova, and the younger generation who know only the ruins. Her final task involves transcribing the core tenets of the Freeholder Agreement, a document emphasizing mutual aid and ecological accountability, into a format durable enough to survive another century, blending ancient inscription techniques with salvaged digital storage, a perfect metaphor for the film's entire thematic achievement. The final scene avoids the traditional shot of characters staring optimistically toward a sunrise. Instead, it focuses on the quiet, cyclical rhythm of the Freeholders' community garden during the early morning mist. It is a world where the shadow of the rage remains, where every harvest is precarious, and where the possibility of renewed infection is an accepted background hum. The emotional weight is one of profound, earned peace, not cinematic victory. The film concludes by suggesting that the true cure for the apocalypse is not the eradication of the virus, but the successful, enduring reformation of human community in its perpetual shadow. The legacy of 28 years later is the quiet triumph of adaptation over dominance. The enduring resonance of this narrative, the quiet triumph over societal collapse, is deliberately undercut by a final, lingering shot that reintroduces an element of ecological dread, suggesting that humanity's success in rebuilding its social contract is constantly threatened by the indifferent, unforgiving natural world. This final threat is not human or viral, but atmospheric, setting the stage for the existential anxiety that might dominate a future installment focusing solely on environmental breakdown. As Marcus watches the mist lift over the communal gardens, a subtle shift in the light catches his eye, not the familiar sickly yellow of the viral contamination zones, but an unnatural, creeping orange tint saturating the upper atmosphere. Flores employs a slow zoom, pulling the focus away from the human microcosm and out toward the vast, indifferent sky. This visual cue references the long-term consequences of the infrastructure failures hinted at earlier, the unchecked industrial decay and the disruption of global systems during the initial chaos. The silence following the resolution of the Directorate conflict is abruptly invaded by a low, almost subsonic atmospheric rumble, a sound that transcends human conflict and speaks to planetary distress. This final emotional beat is carried entirely by Marcus's reaction. His hard-won tranquility fractures instantly. Liam Hayes portrays this relapse not as panic, but as an exhaustion so deep it borders on nihilism. His face, which had softened in the presence of Alara's historical curiosity and Mara's steady resolve, tightens back into the familiar rigid mask of the former Marine. He doesn't look toward the community for reassurance. He looks upward, calculating trajectories and potential shelter against an enemy that cannot be reasoned with, documented, or politically dismantled. His final act of protective instinct is not to draw a weapon, but to swiftly, silently, pull Alara closer, shielding her body against his own, an instinctive gesture of final defense against an enemy that demands humility over mastery. Alara, too, recognizes the shift. Her historical maps and data suddenly seem laughably inadequate. They document human folly, not planetary response. Her emotional response is one of sudden, intense regret for the time spent arguing over the merits of past philosophies when the present environment itself is turning hostile. Her hand instinctively reaches for a satchel containing her most treasured recovered documents, a desperate, futile attempt